Welcome to another edition of Safety Matters. I'm your host, Greg Kerr from Stakeholder Relations, and today we're with John Marshall, TSSA's Fuels Director, for a few thoughts on a review of the propane regulations and some proposals that are coming out of that, as well as new applications of risk and how to minimize the burden on small business. So thanks for being with us today, John.
My pleasure.
Now, a great amount of consultation occurred around this in the form of a roundtable. How did you decide, or how were players sort of brought into it, and what kind of issues were coming forth?
Okay. Well, Greg, it was really a collaboration between the ministry and ourselves. We have our known stakeholders in the propane industry, and they have theirs. And so we really collaborated together and developed a list of we thought were the impacted stakeholders for propane, and brought that group together to look at some proposed enhancements to the propane regulation. Mm-hmm. So that process worked very well, and we had very good interaction with the propane industry and good response and good support from them in terms of the proposals that were put before them.
Mm-hmm. Now, you had other ministry bodies that were part of it as well that may play a role, and the fire marshal too as well.
Oh, absolutely, yes. Part of the stakeholder group we brought into the consultation was the fire marshal's office, as well as some of the local fire services who have expressed support, but also some concerns with some of the proposals, so that we wanted to make sure that we had everybody's input that could provide us with the best possible recommendations to the ministry.
Mm-hmm. And that makes sense. You want to be as inclusive as possible to get all thoughts on the table before anything is set on paper.
Oh, absolutely. That was one of the key things for us in the ministry, was to make sure that we got everybody who could have some input and provide some information to us was brought into the consultation.
Mm-hmm. Now, one of the things that was discussed were the off-site propane storage facilities and the distributors, the licensing specifically for that. But it didn't actually make it in the proposal. Can you maybe explain why that was the case, and why we thought it was important in terms of overall propane safety?
Sure. So when we started the consultation, there were 6 major issues that were identified early on in the process. 4 of those we were able to reach with, have agreement with the industry stakeholders in terms of the 4 proposals. So those are being put forward at this time, and there was 2 others, the fuel distributor licensing regime and off-site storage, as you mentioned, that really needed some further development and some further work before we could kind of put that as a proposal to the minister. So we continue to work on those 2 issues. They're very important to us. One was raised actually by the fire service as something that would impact them being able to respond to emergencies. And the licensing regime for propane distributors was really an issue that was brought forward by the propane industry themselves, and which we are very supportive of and think it just will provide so much value in terms of enhancing safety in Ontario.
What were the particulars around, like why was industry supportive, and what were the...
Well, what we're seeing, Greg, is that we're seeing fuel distributors who are becoming multi-sector, multi-fuel type of distributors. And so we want to make sure that everybody understands their roles and regulations, and in fact they are carrying out those roles and accountability, so that we're keeping everybody safe. And for us and the industry, it was felt that the best way to do that was to license the fuel distributors, so we know who they are, we can track them and monitor their performance and make sure that they're keeping their customers safe as well.
Mm-hmm. And they in turn gain, I guess, acknowledgement of a safe profession and following all the regulations and everything else. So. Now, I also understand that one of the things that we're moving from, away from sort of annual inspections to more a risk-based approach. What are the sort of implications of that? Like, what do we mean to safety, and how will it sort of come to be?
Well, we really look at that as, so if you look back at the requirement for the annual inspection, it was really an outcome of the propane safety panel's review back in 2009, where they had tasked TSSA with conducting annual inspections until such time as we had sufficient data to move to a more risk-based model. And so we now have that. Our risk and safety group has done a lot of analysis for us. They've collected 3 years worth of data, and have built a risk-based model for us to utilize in the propane sector. So what that will allow us to do is really concentrate our efforts where they should be. So to somebody who is totally compliant and runs a good operation, never has any issues, really doesn't maybe make sense to see them every year. And so we can extend their cycle out to 2 or 3 years. And the ones who are not as compliant or have some issues, then we can make their cycle much shorter. So it allows us to focus our resources where the most risk exists.
And you do that intelligently, but at the same time, it's also minimizing the burden.
Oh, absolutely. So part of what we'd like to do is industry has continually asked us to, what's the incentive for the good players? And so this is one where we can now move those folks back to, say, a 3-year inspection cycle, reduces cost and burden and administrative burden on them, but encourages those who aren't quite at that stage yet to kind of raise the bar in their operation.
Mm-hmm. Now, one of the other decisions that was made had to do with moving the risk and safety management plan for the smaller level 1 facilities, and the onus being placed on you, the director. Can you maybe explain what the decision making was around that and how that may benefit safety in a better manner?
Oh, absolutely. So it really puts the responsibility with TSSA, who really has responsibility to administer, the regulations for the province of Ontario. So to give me the latitude to make adjustments and work with the industry to collect the best data, make the best use of the data, and develop the best action plans for making sure that Ontario is safe, just totally makes sense that to give flexibility to the people who carry out that activity to determine, in conjunction with the industry, what would be the best way to move forward.
Mm-hmm. And I guess in that same manner, you can be looking at good players versus less compliant, and you can make decisions based on asking more things out of their risk and safety management plan.
Absolutely.
And less out of others that are...
One of the things that we'll look at, so you mentioned the risk and safety management plan for level 1s. The template we use today was developed a couple of years ago, and it was based on the best evidence and the information we had at the time. And so, we're 2 or 3 years down the road. We have better information, and we have a better sense of what information is valuable to help us make those good decisions. And so we can make adjustments to the information that we want from the level 1 facilities, and that will help reduce some of the burden on them as well.
And I imagine some of the analysis that went into that, you've seen compliance rates go up in propane, so it does sort of make sense to examine that and look where you can make concessions.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Our risk and safety group has looked at all that analysis and all the data we've collected over the last 3 years. And you're absolutely correct, Greg, that the propane industry has gone from a fairly low compliance rate to now what is a fairly good compliance rate. Still some room for improvement, but I'm really pleased with what I've seen in the change. Mm-hmm.
Another element that's part of this proposal has to do with insurance. I believe it said $2 million for smaller facilities and $10 million for larger. How is this any different from what was earlier proposed, and what will the process be like once it's implemented? Like, how will you determine whether someone's got the insurance or whether it's the most appropriate level?
Right. Okay, so you're absolutely right, Greg. I mean, we first had some discussions with the industry back in 2009 after the panel released their report, and we had consultations with the industry at that time, and those were levels of insurance that were actually proposed by the industry at the time, and those have not changed to this day. There's a number of factors involved that the insurance requirements were not implemented in an earlier revision to the propane regulation. And now it would seem we have an opportunity to get those put in there. So those levels were part of the consultation process, and industry has agreed that those still seem to be the most appropriate levels.
Mm-hmm. So how was the figure sort of determined?
Well, so for small groups, it was decided that $2 million would be an appropriate level. So if the small facilities were carrying $2 million, it should cover, costs of anything that perhaps would happen on that size of a facility. The larger ones obviously could have more of an impact, and so the higher levels of insurance.
And I imagine they're looking at standards elsewhere too in terms of
they absolutely
where else.
Have. There was the ministry actually conducted a review of some of the other jurisdictions across Canada just to see if the levels that were being proposed were more or less in line with industry standard, and I think we found that they were.
Mm-hmm. You did mention earlier, I was curious that you said the fire marshal had some concerns about some processes. Do you recall what those were and how they were addressed?
I think that one of the main concerns that the fire marshal and the local fire services had was that there was concern that some facilities, in order to maintain their level 1 status, for instance, if they go over the 5,000 US water gallons, they flip into a level 2 category, and the cost and administrative burden is much more burdensome, I suppose, because they need to have a professional engineer do their plans for them. So there was concern that some would kind of hide propane somewhere, and they wouldn't be aware of it, and something would happen, and the fire service wouldn't really be aware of what they were kind of walking into. So there was an effort and an issue brought forward by them to identify those off-site storages, and as we become aware of those, we'll make sure the local fire service is aware of them so that they're prepared.
Did they have actual cases that they discovered at some point?
I think they had, and what was most concerning is that the fire service had found a particular site and was somewhat transient, and then when they went back the next week it was gone. Mm-hmm. So obviously they've moved it. So if we again can have a licensing regime or some kind of registration regime with the industry, we'll know where these sites are and we'll much better be able to track them.
And catch it and then act on it.
Yes.
Very quickly. Yeah. So John, I know it's just a proposal, but what are the next steps?
Well, for now, so we finished the consultation meetings with the industry. The ministry has prepared the proposals for the 4, and those are now posted on the regulatory registry, and they're up for review now for 45 days. So that review will continue till about March 21st, somewhere around that time frame, and at which time the ministry will take any comments and build those into a briefing paper for the minister. And then that will go to cabinet for consideration for a review of the regulations. So probably we're looking probably early summer, perhaps early to midsummer, before we'll see something finalized with the proposed date. If the proposals were to be approved, would probably be January 1st of 2015.
And we'll post what the responses were, the review.
Yeah. One of the things that TSSA is working on right now is the ministry is while all this work is going on in the background, we'll start to look at a communication plan and an implementation plan for if those proposals get approved. Mm-hmm. We'll look at how we'll best implement that, and so we'll prepare a communication package for all of our stakeholders, so the license holders in Propane, and we'll send out an information package to them probably late summer, early fall.
Is it likely that the roundtable will reconvene at some point?
I don't think that the roundtable is intended to reconvene unless there's some major issues that come forward out of the posting on the EBR comments. Mm-hmm. One of the things that the Canadian Propane Association has asked is for MCS and TSSA in conjunction to meet with their membership to just provide some further perhaps clarification and discussion on the proposals as they go forward.
That's great, and the mechanism is there in the first place if it's required anyway going forward.
Right. Oh, absolutely, yeah.
Fantastic. Thanks a lot, John.
My pleasure.
Stay tuned for more TSA safety matters. We will be posting an update on the reviews of the propane proposal in upcoming episodes.